So the first topic we're going to cover was were the peace treaties 1919 to 1923 fair? So the first thing we're going to look at is the actual peace treaties that you need to know about for your exam. And these were the key ones that occurred during the film period. The most important one that you must have heard of when you've been studying is the Treaty of Versailles, which was signed by Germany on the 28th of June 1990. It took away 13% of Germany's land, 12.5% of its population, 16% of their coal fields, nearly 50% of the country's iron and steel industry, and a total of 3/4 of its iron ore. Now, the main terms of the Treaty of Versailles can be anachronized using GARGLE, which stands for the Guilt, Arms Restrictions, Reparations, German Territory, and the League of Nations Establishment. So the Guilt clause, or otherwise known as the Diktat, was Article 231 and essentially appointed all the blame upon Germany for the causing of the war. Then there was the Arms Restrictions clause, which basically restricted the German army size and power to a significant amount. The army can only have a maximum of 100,000 non-conscripted. Conscription was banned to soldiers. The navy could only have 6 battleships, a maximum of 15,000 sailors and no submarines, and an air force was wholly forbidden. The Rhineland was also demilitarized. Then there are the reparations, which weren't actually set until 1921, which is a key piece of knowledge, especially if you're doing this to your paper 2 source, which you will be if you're taking the exam in 2017, because this will often come up as a piece of source work where you're given a source which shows a complaint or for the reparations, which is actually before they're set, and so it's in hope or view there will be a large sum of money, and that sum of money was £6.6 billion, British pounds sterling. Then there was a German territory, so Alsace-Lorraine was lost to France, the Danzig was given to Poland, and West Prussia and Posen also given to Poland to form the Polish corridor, giving them access to the sea. East Prussia was then separated from the rest of Germany, and then also lots of the colonies of Germany, such as Togoland, Cameroon, German Southwest Africa, and German East Africa, were given to the victors, that's Britain, France, etc. Then the final point was the League of Nations was established. Now this was part of Wilson's 14 points you'll hear about in a bit, and this was meant to be an organisation to help maintain the peace after war and avoid another war like what they'd just been through. So that's the main points of the Treaty of Versailles. We'll hear more about what happened at the Versailles when they were negotiating it and how it was arranged, because Germany didn't really get a say in it and things like that. Next, we're going to look at the Treaty of Saint-Germain, Austria, in 1990. This established the Anschluss ban, which essentially meant that Austria could not rejoin Germany, join up with Germany and become a united state. That was banned. And there were also reparations imposed, but these weren't fully paid due to certain situations and things like that. Their army was reduced to 30,000 men, and the dual monarchy that they currently had was ended. Then there was some land taken off them, so Galicia was given to Poland, Bohemia and Moravia to Czechoslovakia, and Bosnia and Herzegovina to Yugoslavia. It's also led to severe economic problems, which is one of the reasons they didn't really pay much of their reparations, due to the result of their industrial land going to Czechoslovakia. So they didn't have much income. There was also quite a large displacement of people from Austria. Then there's the Treaty of Trianon with Hungary, which was in 1920, and the treaty's terms and reparations ended up inducing a massive economic crisis in Hungary because it wasn't in a great state, and so no reparations were actually paid. But they did lose some land. So Transylvania was given to Romania, Slovakia and Ruthenia to Czechoslovakia, Slovenia and Croatia were given to Yugoslavia. And about 3 million Hungarians were actually displaced by this into different countries. Then the Treaty of Neuilly with Bulgaria in 1919, and because Bulgaria was quite a minor player in the war, it only took some territory from places. Turkey, just tiny bits, didn't have much, it didn't face too much, but it did have an army size reduced to 20,000 men. There was £100 million reparation, but lots of this didn't get paid, and they lost lands to Greece, to Romania, Yugoslavia, and they lost quite a big chunk of their access to the Mediterranean Sea, essentially cutting them off for any further warfare for quite some time. Then there was a set of 2 treaties, the Treaty of Sèvres with the Ottoman Empire in 1920, and then later in 1923, the Treaty of Lausanne with the Ottoman Empire. So in 1920, negotiation on territorial terms, e.g. working out whose territory would go to which, by Mustafa Kemal, a leader of the Young Turk Revolution, led to a war between Greeks and Turks, and it kind of led the treaty to be very unsuccessful due to certain areas being into certain people. Arabs were promised Arab state from siding with Britain and France to defeat Germany, and so there's the Palestine issue, which still exists today. Many people probably know of it, and that's quite a big point. So after there was all this revolution with the Young Turk Revolution, Treaty of Lausanne was created in 1923, which gave the disputed region of Smayan back to Turkey after the Young Turk Revolution. So the main big outcomes of lots of these treaties is this. There was the Treaty of Versailles, which was pushing blame onto Germany. It was damaging Germany for starting the war, all that kind of stuff. And that gets covered quite a lot. Treaty of Versailles is a big treaty, so you need to remember the information I said earlier. But the outcome was Czechoslovakia was formed, carved out of old Austrian Empire and Germany, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Bohemia and Moravia. Yugoslavia is formed as the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenians, then named Land of the South Slavs. Poland was kind of renewed, given new life, given a lot of land. Via Danzig and the Polish corridor, which made up West Prussia and Posen, it was given access to the sea. And Danzig wasn't technically Poland's, it was a mandate of the League of Nations, but it was given to Poland's control and full use. Poland was kind of seen as the watchdog on Germany. It was the buffer against communism, which of course Britain and France were all up for. And although 30% not ethically, authentically Polish, there was so that meant quite a lot of demographic problems, and there was lots of territory possibly shouldn't have been taken from Russia. And there were small wars with Russia in 1921 and things like that. Then Syria and Lebanon were French mandate. Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq became British mandates. And under Article 119 of the Treaty of Versailles, all Germany's colonies taken and given to France and Britain as mandates, which essentially meant that they didn't own them, but they controlled them and managed them, which for Britain and France essentially meant they had a new colony. So there is the main information behind each of the peace treaties, and that's quite useful to know because if you're doing a paper 2 source that's in 2017, you will need to know this information to help you answer your questions on your sources. But it's also useful in helping you remember exactly what you've got to do for each treaty. You can just go Treaty of Lausanne, Ottoman Empire, done after the Young Turk Revolution with Mustafa Kemal. You can go straight Treaty of Versailles, gargle, guilt, arms restrictions, reparations, territory, League of Nations established. You can go Treaty of Trianon, Hungary, economic crisis, Transylvania, Slovakia, 3 million Hungarians. You can quickly flip that information, go Bulgaria, 20,000 men, armed forces, Saint-Germain, 1919, Austria, no Anschluss. That's key for the information, and it's good to know that, I think. Now we're going to look at the motives and the aims of the big three of Versailles. This is quite a nice topic. Now ask questions to see your opinion on it and how they think that they were satisfied. You'll get the questions of were they satisfied. So why would any of the three leaders be dissatisfied with the Treaty of Versailles? So the French Prime Minister, Georges Clemenceau, was a realist. He wanted a peace and conversation that's aimed to weaken Germany as much as possible and blame them alone so that they didn't come back again, so it damaged them enough so they didn't have the ability to fight back. And they wanted reparations, compensation for the infrastructural and moral damage that had been caused by Germany, because France had been invaded twice since 1870. And of course they also wanted the military restrictions. Now Clemenceau himself didn't have such a harsh view on this, but for example the leader of France, the France president, wanted Poincaré is his name, wanted Germany broken, and lots of people wanted Germany broken to smaller confederations, an independent Rhineland, and permanent control of the Saarland. So the thing with the Saarland was it was a 15-year plebiscite. After 15 years, there was to be a plebiscite which decided whether it went back to Germany or France. Now, France were reaping the rewards of having the Saarland for that 15 years, allowing them to earn all the money from the industry and recuperate. But after that point, there was a plebiscite controlled by the League of Nations, and it did go to Germany, which you'll find out later, and that's Nazi Germany, that's Hitler's Germany. So Clemenceau wanted, like most French people, a very harsh treaty, but he knew exactly that he couldn't get everything he wanted, and he would know that he'd face a lot of pressure from the French government, from the French people, to get the harshest treaty possible. But he wasn't quite sure if he could side with Poincaré, because at the end of the day, he wasn't going to get France broken into smaller states and things like that. But I have to wait and see. Then there was the American president, Woodrow Wilson, who was an idealist who wanted to punish Germany, but not too harshly, because he saw that if Germany was to be too weak, then communism could easily spread into it. And as an American, especially, they did not like the spread of communism. There was also the view that if Germany was made too weak, they would want revenge. They would come back fighting for more and more, and again, they might look to communism to give them help into doing it. And so he wanted to strengthen the democracy internationally and in Germany through his 14 points, which covered things from disarmament, League of Nations, self-determination. And these kind of points showed his want to build a more peaceful world. They wanted to really make sure Germany was punished for what they did. He still wanted reparations, but they were treated in the right way to stop any further events. There were, however, some issues with these main ideas. Issue with self-determination is that people of Eastern Europe scattered across many countries. And so 25% of people who lived in Czechoslovakia were not Czechs or Slovaks, 30% of Poland not Polish, 3 million Hungarians being ruled by foreigners, and some people were bound to end up being ruled by another group with different customs and languages because borders were artificially opposed. They were created at any point. And this also caused a lot of conflict with all the treaties that were created. It could cause a lot of fighting because people would go, well, how's this? These people are getting self-determination and we're not. You're putting us into a different person's rule. For example, those 3 million Hungarians or the 12.5% population of Germany, they could argue they're being put in a place where they're not actually stuck to the customs or the rules. There was also issues with the League of Nations because, first of all, lots of people didn't join, including the US. The US, Germany, and USSR were all absolutely not in there. US Congress banned them from going in. They were stopped, and so this was kind of a crush to Wilson's dream because the League of Nations was his idea, his setup, his ambition, and unfortunately Congress shut him from doing it. Then Germany and the USSR were essentially banned from joining. The League of Nations was also very toothless. It didn't have a military, it didn't have its own military. It purely relied on the members to provide the backing, and it was also very quite structurally insufficient and confusing. It was very weighted towards the bigger people, the big countries at the top that had in the council, not in the assembly, in the council, that could instantly stop a decision if they felt it wasn't there. And that was built up of the big powers who had control over everyone. So there was also the issue of having to have unanimous votes, which meant things could be very quickly done. And mandates, which were meant to be mandates of the League of Nations, were often controlled by Britain or France, the big powers in the League of Nations who had all the money, all the force, and all the votes in the council, and that's what counted. And so the idea of the League of Nations was such a good one, but in many ways it didn't practice out fully. And you'll see lots of that a bit later on when we look at the successes and failures of the League. Then there was Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, who is kind of in the midst between Wilson and Clemenceau. He was the middleman. He was a mediator. He wanted a very strong punishment, but he also wanted a peaceful punishment to both not get Germany to be revengeful, but also wanted to not damage them enough to stop them being trade partners, because as usual Britain was quite worried about their empire. But could have been peeved off because he wanted Germany to lose its colonies and the navy as they threatened the British Empire. They were the things that Britain saw as an issue. They didn't want to get Germany to seek revenge, but they wanted to push them into getting punished because they did cost Britain quite a lot, but they still wanted them to keep as trade partners to increase their empire, for Britain to be able to increase their jobs, keep their jobs, and push further for more money options. So Lloyd George was quite self-interested with the aims of Britain, but he still wanted to punish Germany, just not enough so they would impact the British-German relationship they previously had. So now we're going to look at why did all the victors not get everything they wanted? Because you guys know the Treaty of Versailles terms. There wasn't too much of everything. There's a lot of giving away of colonies, but then there's also other things. So they all had to make compromises. Clemenceau wanted a harsh peace, though he wasn't fully for broken up Germany and broken up Germany. He had to fight for it because that's what his president, his people wanted. They wanted broken Germany. He and the rest of France wanted an independent Rhineland as a kind of buffer between Germany and disarm Germany along with compensation, which basically meant that they wouldn't be a threat anymore. Germany couldn't smash France again. And he did get some of this. He got limited compensation. If you say 6.6 billion is limited, but that wasn't decided until 1921, and it was quite, in many ways, retrospective to how much France actually lost, not worth much. So he got that compensation, and he did get the disarmament of Rhineland. So that was kind of a midway between getting independent Rhineland, because it meant that it wasn't as much of a threat. It was kind of a buffer area. But military restrictions were also placed, which kind of weakened Germany to an extent where France was safe. But there was things that obviously didn't happen. So a unified Germany remained. There was, okay, parts of West Prussia and things, East Prussia were cut off from Germany, but they were still part of Germany. There were no smaller states. It wasn't back to how it had previously been, say, 150 years ago. It was still very unified and central. And they weren't given full control of the Saarland. It was a mandate that they get the profits from a certain amount of time, but it wasn't quite what they really needed or wanted. And he felt that this was not harsh enough, and so did the French public, as he lost the next general election. Now, Wilson wanted a just peace based on the 14 points that he had, because America hadn't experienced a massive loss during the war. Yes, they had, but Germany, first of all, hadn't been their main aggressor. They were just there to help out Britain and France, etc. But of course, they wanted the 14 points. He wanted that peace in the world, so essentially America didn't have to deal with this kind of thing, didn't have to help out again, even though it did end up being quite profitable for them. If you've done the US debt study, you know about how it kind of increased their wealth and how the economic boom. So Wilson just wanted those 14 points. He didn't want Germany blamed, which of course didn't happen with the Article 221 and the high reparations and the Treaty of Versailles. Of course, he didn't get what he wanted. He did have a successfully established, so to speak, self-determination in Eastern Europe and the League of Nations, and it was kind of the point that people were getting to be in their own country, not under a foreign ruler. But many people argue that this was broken by the Treaty of Versailles. You're taking Germans. This was broken by the Treaty of Trianon. It's broken by the Treaty of Neuilly. All those treaties broken because you're taking people from their country. 3 million Hungaries in the Treaty of Trianon, 1920, with Hungary were displaced, and you can argue, how is that really like self-determination for the people? Of course, his dream of demilitarization wasn't really achieved without really the force that was pushed from Germany. Like, Germany had to demilitarize because Britain and France were saying, you've got to, or you've got to accept this. It's a diktat. This is our treaty. You've got to accept it, or it's not good enough, and you're done for. So that really meant, and to be honest, the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations ultimately were not ever ratified. They weren't ever fully fulfilled. So Wilson kind of didn't really get much he wanted, but he got that main point, that 14th point that the League of Nations was established, and he did kind of see some starts of demilitarization and self-determination and a push for more peace. It showed the countries more pushing for peace, but the fact that then the US Congress stopped him from joining the League, the US did not join the League, kind of pushed his contributions and his view of the Treaty of Versailles to the back of the window, because he was like the man who was there to bring peace, bring goodness, and he wasn't even taking part in that. Then Britain, of course, wanted a compromise peace. They wanted Germany and people to be restricted, but they also wanted things to be done properly. Now, Lloyd George and Britain were quite happy with the Treaty of Versailles at the time. They were very happy that German armed and naval forces were obviously cut down. They were restricted, which basically meant there was no pose to the British Empire. Of course, the colonies had gone to the Britain through the process of mandates, which essentially meant they owned it. So there wasn't much animosity there. It was quite a public thing that he was quite a hero. And there was still the threat of the spread of communism. There was the need for the buffers, and obviously they would have probably preferred the reparations to be slightly lower, because of course it cut off Germany's trade partner for a bit longer. And there's a couple of things they probably would have preferred to be, but Lloyd George, out of the three, probably came off the best, or Wilson did. Clemenceau obviously did come off so well. Now, there were throughout the treaty disagreements over the self-determination access to the CiE clause that were added into the treaty, as well as the harshness, because the League of Nations represented what Wilson wanted as a world parliament, whilst Lloyd George wanted just organisation that gets together in emergencies, in world crises when war's about to happen, not something that's continually meeting and discussing. And so they had quite a little tiffle there. And then Clemenceau was there resenting what Wilson was pushing for the generosity, and was rather looking for a very strong league that had a permanent army that could enforce peace, that could really push for peace. And so they had a lot of quits about that. And then, of course, the access to sea clause was a big threat to the British Empire, because they obviously had a large navy, a large trade impact via the sea, and so they were kind of the dominant in that area. Clemenceau felt that Britain was happy to treat Germany fairly in Europe, because Britain wanted to get the trade going. They wanted to keep the relationship that was in many ways economically beneficial to Britain with Germany. And this was a massive threat to Clemenceau, because France were obviously very angry. They were the ones that experienced the most damage. Their fighting had happened on their territory. They had the most impacts, and they were quite worried that they were not happy. They were worried that they weren't going to get what they deserved, and they weren't that happy when it came to the concessions of colonies and military, because they thought that they should have all of it. They should have greater threats on the military, because they were the first people Germany was going to attack. They weren't that happy that the colonies were given a lot to Britain, because Britain was not the people that had all their land essentially trashed. And so there's lots of kind of tension going on between the leaders, but there wasn't, in the end, they were all moderately happy with the treaty that came out. So the impact of the peace treaties in Germany up to 1923 was quite bad. So there was a large amount of reactions. There was horror and outrage at the war guilt clause, because they felt they weren't the only ones that had caused it. Yes, most Germans accepted that they had been a key part in causing it, but they did not think that they should be blamed wholly for the war. Other people were involved in the war, and so they felt they were betrayed, and they felt they'd been blamed by the November criminals, the old government, and the Jews and the communists. They didn't feel that they had lost the war, but they felt that they were being robbed of their correct fight, the thing that they pushed hard for, because they'd been fighting just as hard as everyone else, and they, for most of the war, had been really winning it. But of course, most of them overlooked the fact that they were looking at an impending loss, and it would have been damaging, so it's rather to take that. But they never fully believed they lost the war, so the war guilt clause was not really something that they really liked. There was also a lot of distaste because the government wasn't represented at the Versailles conference. It was a diktat, so to speak. They didn't really get an opinion in the treaty, didn't get a say, didn't get a voice. And there was also the view that Germany was quite a militaristic country. They were very proud of all the things that they've done. They were proud of having a massive dominant army. It was their thing. So they were quite annoyed by the limited German army, especially the fact that only they had to disarm, other countries were not disarming, so they would feel they were treated quite unfairly. The country was also pushed deeper into a state of near starvation. They had a crippling economy because of the reparations, which were announced in 1921. They couldn't afford to pay it, and they saw themselves as being ripped off. They saw themselves being pushed into a corner they couldn't get out of. They were dying. Their government, their economy was going down the drain. And they also saw that their colonies were being taken as a kind of double standard for self-determination. Their land were taken as a double standard for self-determination because Germans were being displaced. 12.5% of the population was no longer in Germany. They weren't allowed to join up with Austria, even though there was many German speakers in Austria. They were very similar countries. Germans people were displaced, and they weren't allowed to rule themselves, which was quite a harsh thing. This led to a big impact because it was a new government. It wasn't the same government that had been involved in the war, so they saw themselves as a new country. But the new governments created, there was a lot of scapegoating occurred. There was blame on the communists, they blame on the nationalists, there was big wars. not wars, there's big infighting, there were scapegoats used from things like Jews, communism, there was November criminals, which was a stab in the fact theory that the previous government had taken the easy clause out and ran away, blaming it all on the rest of the people. And that led to a lot of political violence. There was the Spartakists in 1919, there was the Cat Push, which was an attempt to overthrow the government in 1920, the Munich Push, the Ruhr invasion, in which France killed over 100 German workers and expelled over 100,000 due to the lack of reparation payments in 1923. This was called the Ruhr Crisis, and this is what eventually led to hyperinflation due to the striking workers that the government ordered to strike being paid with money that was extra printed, and so very soon hyperinflation was ridiculous. The fact that money was worthless and kids played with it in the streets. There's massive economic issues, and the country couldn't do much with the reparations. And then the Treaty of Versailles is probably one of the key things that was essentially blamed for the rise of Hitler. Hitler used the unpopularity of Treaty of Versailles in his speeches, in his methods, as his advantage by luring people to the nationalist ideas of restoring his homeland's former glory, the one right, getting the self-determination they need, the army size they need, and push for what they really wanted. And he also used, of course, the scapegoating theories of Jews, communism, things like that. So we've looked at why the Treaty of Versailles might have been seen unfair, who was pissed off with it, and how it impacted Germany and people like that. But was it actually fair? Because did it really actually equate to what should have been done? And so we're going to look first at the no side, and then we'll look at the yes side of the treaty. So on the no side of was it too fair, it was too harsh, because it blamed Germany, the new government, instead of the old government. And so it blamed essentially the wrong people, the people that didn't cause the war, the people that didn't start issues. They were the new democratic government. They were forming as one on condition of a peace agreement. They were there to make Germany a better place. It also crippled the German economy and left people near to death. Germans had not been fairly represented when these now near-death people were not represented at that conference. They were a dictator. And then they weren't the only country to blame. They were to blame, and most Germans recognise that, but they weren't the only ones to blame. And then they did expect a treaty. From hearing Wilson's 14 points, they expected a treaty based on those. If Wilson's going to say those, why can't we be given a treaty on them? But they weren't really given it. And there was also the fact that whilst Germany were having to pay reparations for the damage they caused, they had also had a massive physical effect damaged on them. There was farmers massively employed into the army, pushed into the army, meaning that there was a massive shortage in farmers and food production. There was by 1918, only 50% of the milk production and 6% of the meat and production existed of what had previously been war levels. So that was helped lead to the famine, because obviously they couldn't really afford to buy food. The potato supply ran out in 1916 to 1917 winter, meaning that millions of people didn't have good source of nutrients. And this combined effect of hunger and disease killed up to 750,000 German people just from the fact that they couldn't do anything. So it showed the treaty is very, very harsh, and was essentially blaming people who, at the end of the day, it wasn't exactly their fault, and they were dying and suffering and having a terrible, poor piece of life. One that was meant to be based on the 14 points, but they never really saw it as that. Then you've got to look at the yes reasons of why it was fair, and it was the fact that economic troubles were actually self-inflicted in many ways, as other countries raised taxes and practiced more vigorous fiscal policies to pay off reparations. Britain had a greater debt, paid off more than Germany by introducing higher taxes, but they didn't do that, so they didn't manage their money very well, they didn't look at it carefully. And also the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which they had imposed on Russia just a couple of years earlier, was way harsher than what the Treaty of Versailles was. It took 32% of the land, 34% of the population, 4% of the industry, and 300 million gold ruble. Nearly 3/4 of its iron ore and half of its industry. This crippled Russia in many of the parts that they had conquered. And so it was kind of a, Germany, you're complaining about this, but look what you just did. And that was the thing. It was a treaty that could be seen as not fair because it was so harsh, but looking in retrospect, at the time it was very clear that it was probably the way that they were looking at it. Brest-Litovsk had been so harsh that if Germany had won, there's a famous cartoon which says it's a man going, "Oh, you would have charged us so much more." And it's the fact that, yes, they've, in hindsight, they very would have. It was the fact that if they'd won, if Germany had won the war, and those side had won the war, Britain would have been crippled, France would have been crippled by this treaty that they imposed on them. So it was kind of a, yeah, well, you would have done it, so we're going to do it too. So finally, in this topic, we're going to look at, could the treaties be justified at the time? So first we've got to look at no. The Treaty of Versailles led to the rise of Hitler, as the army crippled was so cruel. And though this was a bit on further on with the rise of Hitler, it's still quite relevant to the fact, because you could still look at it in hindsight from now and see how the Treaty of Versailles was fair. So it's something you've got to be careful of using. You always look at the dates, but it is key in knowing. It led to a genocidal regime. It defeated the nation's disadvantages of vengeance, and so it kind of crushed down to things. Treaty was ignored. It was bound to fail. The treaty, it didn't. It pushed for Germany to basically get revenge. It pushed for Germany to strengthen. It wasn't harsh enough that Germany couldn't strengthen, but it wasn't soft enough where Germany wouldn't want to strengthen. And so many of the points in it were just as ineffective as the Treaty of Sevres, which was redrawn after 3 years due to failing the Treaty of Lausanne. And so many people see the treaty as justified at the time as no, it wasn't, because it was too harsh. It was not correct. It wasn't harsh enough to kill them. It wasn't soft enough to not make them angry, and didn't know enough. And if you look at the actual time of looking at it, it was, yes, it was fair and it was justified, because it was, of course, straight after the war, people were in a kind of war of, we need to recover. Everyone was looking at their self-interest over why we give a damn about Germany. They caused all these issues. Most countries, including places like France, were in the state of near starvation, infrastructural ruin. There was a lot of public pressure from the people to punish the defeated parties, because how else are you going to get the money back? How else are you going to deal with it? And some people, yeah, as I said, view it as not harsh enough. You needed to really punish them, or there'd be issues. And many of the German problems were self-inflicted by bad fiscal policy, which meant bad economic policy, bad money policy, and the Brest-Litovsk hypocrisy. Like, how could they say that the Treaty of Versailles is so unfair if Brest-Litovsk was even harsher? This covers the first topic of were the peace treaties of 1919 to 1923 fair. And so I advise you just maybe replay over this tape just to hear about the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 with Germany, Treaty of Saint-Germain with Austria in 1919, Treaty of Trianon with Hungary in 1920, Treaty of Neuilly with Bulgaria in 1919, Treaty of Sevres with the Ottoman Empire in 1920, then that rewriting of the Treaty of Lausanne. And of course, I can remember over what the motives, the big three were in the Treaty of Versailles, look at how the treaties can be justified, what happened in the treaties, and how dissatisfied or satisfied the leaders were with their treaties.